Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thanks to everyone joining us from wherever you are in the world. Welcome to day 3 of our Risk Management Summit. I hope you have enjoyed the sessions you've seen over the last 3 days. Again, lots of useful insights from our fantastic range of speakers. So I'm Chris Boyle, Practice Director for Identity and Access Management at Turnkey Consulting, and I'll be your host for the session. It's my absolute pleasure today to welcome Dan Latimer from CyberArk, who are the global leaders in privileged access management. Today, Dan will be talking about how to reduce operational risk and protect your company's crown jewels by implementing privileged access management, or PAM as it's more commonly known. Not only can PAM help protect, but at the same time provide a much better user experience while increasing the control you have over your landscape, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud. So the main topics that we will be covering today are around understanding what privileged access is and what it means to your organization, increasing operational efficiencies while at the same time reducing risk and satisfying your compliance requirements, why you should invest in PAM and how to get a return on your investment in a very short period of time. Additionally, as with any new technology, there will be a level of change required within the organization. So Dan will talk around how to effectively manage that change and have PAM become the new normal. And speaking of the new normal, in the context of people working from home or remotely, Dan will also touch upon the remote workforce and how to make them much more effective and much more secure at the same time. And then finally, help anyone about to embark on a PAM journey understand where is the best place to start. So just before I do hand over to Dan, it's worth mentioning that if you do have any questions, please do ask them in the comment section of the webinar, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can at the end of the session. However, that's enough from me. It's time I hand it over to our resident PAM expert. So without further ado, I will hand over control to Dan. Dan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you asking me to present today. So we will be going through a couple of areas today. We will be talking about where we typically see privilege in an environment today, what that looks like from a risk perspective, and also an operational perspective and the impact that CyberArk can have in a positive manner. And ultimately, how do we then achieve this? What are the questions we need to ask ourselves? What are the things we need to be aware of? What are the things we need to think about before embarking on one of these programs of work? But before we dive into this, it's really important to kind of get a definition of what is a privileged account. Now, typically, a privileged account and a privileged user is something that is used to gain access to a system that, if changed, will have some form of positive or detrimental effect. So somebody has access to a database, can add information, but also delete that information. Someone has access to infrastructure, can create, but also delete. So these accounts are fundamental. They are needed to run IT in the modern world, but they also have a lot of risk associated with them. Now, most of the time, a privileged user is defined as a technical individual, somebody that has access to underlying systems, operating systems, infrastructure, applications. But that is starting to change over time, and we'll go through that later in the presentation. But just when we're talking at the moment, we're thinking about a technical individual using an account that has above normal privileges to do something that could potentially do something good or bad. So where do they exist? Well, all infrastructure, all applications, all systems have a wide variety of different accounts on them. Some are standard accounts. My accounts to access my laptop, to access the applications I use, are standard. But those applications by my administrators and the teams that support those systems are privileged, and they are everywhere. Originally, there would have been less privileged accounts on environments when we're talking about legacy estates. But as we start to see IT sprawl across SaaS, IaaS, PaaS, into robots, DevOps, this is ever expanding and getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more complicated as time goes on. So if we just look at the path of a privileged account and how this can be used in a nefarious way. Now, however somebody would gain access to an environment in a way that is that we don't expect, this example is phishing, but it can be anything. Once somebody has gained access, they can then use that credential on the system that they gain access to start sniffing around. And it looks like legitimate traffic. And what an attacker will do is use the credential to go and find another credential that's been left behind. And by doing this, what they're trying to do is find a staging point to gain access to another system. and they can start to proliferate. It's called lateral movement. And the whole aim of this is to end up at the place where they want to either cause damage or take information. And the standard pattern will be from a workstation, which typically has low value to an organization, through to a server, which is slightly more valuable, through to the intended target, whether it be a domain controller to gain full access and control of the environment, or to a database, or to a system, or whatever it might be. And this process is very, very common, very, very simple to use, and lots of major breaches that we've seen in the last few years has followed this flow. Now, this is from an attacker's point of view. If an administrator wants to do legitimate work, they're not necessarily going to sit there and try and find credentials, but they will use credentials to gain access to every single one of these systems. So it becomes very difficult to look at legitimate and non-legitimate traffic, and also then start to control that in the right way. So let's look at some of purely operational efficiencies in a moment, and some risks around that. So let's look at workstations. So workstations have administrative rights on them. And there's a few areas here. They are used to change system configurations, install printers, install applications. They can be used to install legitimate applications or install non-legitimate applications, those that are bad, those that are non-trustworthy, or those that are just legitimate malware. And these credentials can also be used to access and change accounts within that system. And organizations typically will have quite a problem managing these. And there is an operational problem and also a risk problem. So if we look at the operational impacts, if we completely remove administrative accounts from users, whenever they want to go and do something, whether that be install a printer, install a new application, they need to go and raise a ticket and go and ask for permission for that. Now, in the ever-changing and dynamic world that we live in, that can add time into development, can add time into building products, or it can be, at the end of a quarter, a very painful thing when you're trying to get an order through and completed. So completely removing them has quite a lot of negative impacts to your user community. Likewise, leaving them completely open gives you quite a large security hole, because these accounts can be very easily used, and users can deliberately or accidentally install things and do things they're not supposed to. So really what we are trying to do here is balance here and allow users a semblance of control over their own workstation in line with policy that allows them to install applications and run systems and run things that are known and good and trusted, whilst also minimizing the attack surface and reducing the impact if a system is compromised. So what does this look like and how does this work? There are thousands of applications, there's thousands of processes, there's thousands of things that an individual can potentially do with a workstation or desktop. So we have to start grouping these systems and applications into logical groups that allow us to then apply control. Now, the simplest place to do this is looking at any form of internal publishing system. The applications held there are known, trusted, and are pushed out from the business to the user community. And if a user wants to install or run one of these systems that's known and good, let's go for it. Likewise, if we are trying to install a printer within a known network zone, within an office, that's probably good traffic. Whereas if someone is trying to install a printer outside of that network, we then have to make a decision as to whether that's good or bad. Likewise, there are a number of known bad applications, those that are just malware, those that are nefarious systems, and we can look at a number of trusted sources, whether that be CyberArk themselves or any kind of vulnerability scanner or antivirus system, or a multitude of things that you'll have in your own environment to be able to profile applications and make a decision as to whether it's good or bad. If it's bad, we can block it. And then we're left with a small pile that we're not really sure about. These are ones that aren't necessarily good, aren't necessarily bad, and we have to make decisions around. And the simplest thing to do here, and it depends on the organization, but you would like to be able to allow users some element of freedom to run applications, but in a safe way, where we can allow a user to run an application, but then restrict what that application can and can't do. So for example, we don't want an unknown application to be able to connect to internal data stores, or be able to call out to the internet to some kind of command and control center. So we can start to restrict that application, where a developer can use these cool new tools that are always coming out, but restrict what that application can do. So if it is trying to do something that is nefarious, we are blocking that and stopping that. And what does that look like? Well, we are really looking at this from an operational perspective. we're looking at a pure cost reduction in the amount of tickets that need to be raised. Now, there's a number of numbers on here, and I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to call out a couple that are really important. The average service desk ticket will cost about £7. That's the cost of raising it, managing it, responding to it, and the efficiency and the loss of productivity that a user will take in waiting for that fix to be applied. And you can quite quickly see that in a 1,000-person company, we would expect around 200 tickets a month, of which maybe 80 of them will have some form of application needs or admin rights associated with it. And that the average cost of a business user in the UK today is around £30,000. And that user will lose about 15 minutes of productivity. We can quite quickly see there is a cumulative impact to running things in the normal manner. So by allowing users a way to self-serve, allowing users to be able to run known good applications whilst blocking bad applications, can quite quickly, just purely operationally, give us quite a good benefit just in terms of reducing the number of tickets and the efficiency associated with that. And of course, from a risk perspective, we are reducing the impact of malware. We're reducing the impact of known attack techniques, which originate from the workstation, which allow users to either deploy malware, deploy ransomware, or be able to use that as an entry point through into more valuable assets into the system. So let's look at another key area. A lot of outages, in fact, most outages, I'd say, in organizations are around change, and particularly unauthorized change. So privileges have a very large part to play. Now, change management, fundamental IT principle, every organization on the planet does this to some degree. And really, it's a policy at its heart. We are asking users when they are doing some form of change to a system that they follow the policy of requesting access, that be validated by the change approval board, and then they give them approval to do so at a defined period of time. But we know users think, but it's only a little change. We can go and make that here, and it isn't going to change anything. It isn't going to cause any damage. And over time, one change might not, but that 11th change might knock over a system, causing an outage, causing an issue, which costs money to then go and fix and deal with. And really, that policy is like a speed limit. You're supposed to follow it, but unless you're watched, people do go outside of that. So we have this bucket of change, which is completely unapproved, where users can gain access to systems and do things which they feel is legitimate and is supposed to be good, but they just don't know the wider context of what that change means in the ecosystem. And that causes issues. It causes visibility issues because we don't know where a problem originated from. And because it's based on a policy, which typically has quite hard penalties for going outside of it, people don't want to expose that they've made a change somewhere that has caused an issue. And the other piece here is we need to think about adding and changing and removing users as part of this process. Do we want to give somebody or give a group of users access to systems all the time when they only need to make break fixes occasionally? So all of this in total causes quite a lot of cost just in people accessing systems outside of a known policy that we all currently run in our organisation. Now, Gartner estimates this to be about £5,500 a minute. That's across all organisations of all sizes. But even if it's considerably less than that, there is still a significant cost around unauthorised change. So how do we look at this? Well, essentially, what we will do here is give the right person the right access to the right resources at the right time for the right reason. And that reason is change. So a user wanting to gain access to a system can no longer physically gain access to it without coming through a control point of privilege. And when that user wants to gain access to that system, they will log in, connect to it, and the system can then interrogate the change management system to whether that is the right user on the right system at the right time and that change has been approved. If so, off you go and make that change. It's recorded, and then the completion of that is then put back into change. So now we've actually got a closed loop change system where users can no longer get direct access to systems outside of the approval process. And when it's been approved, we know it's the right person making the change. And what does this look like? Again, this is, these are some numbers. There's a lot here, but I'll try and go through this quickly. We're assuming here that an organization will have 2 instances of downtime in a year due to unauthorized change. And we'll just call these medium impacts. We're not going to count the multitude of little ones that happen within a year. We're not going to choose those very, very large ones that happen infrequently, but 2 medium impact changes a year. And the average downtime of this is around 4.7 hours. That's from the point of downtime to fix. And the cost of that is about £20,000 an hour. And that's total cost. That's the loss of productivity. That's the loss of the actual system itself and the value it's bringing to the business. The cost of IT that has to then come and fix. And then also any kind of services or technical changes that need to be implemented to then fix it. You can see quite quickly, with a very small number of changes and a relatively small amount of downtime, with a relatively small amount of cost associated with it, starts to blow up into quite a large annual cost around change. Now, I suspect you as an organisation will have some kind of visibility around this. And I'm not saying that privilege can eliminate all of it, but it can certainly reduce the impact associated with it. The users can no longer gain access to systems without following change management. We can see here very clearly that the cumulative cost associated with change and unauthorized change goes up and up and up, but we can actually start to reduce that and actually get a cumulative benefit by reducing that unauthorized change and controlling which users can gain access to which systems at what time with the right approval. So, remote workforce. This is an area which has obviously been very important over the last few months. It's always been important and it's been ever changing. So if we look at the total remote users, there's an awful lot of people now. You know, we've got external consultants, we've got service companies, we've got supply chain, we've got providers. We've also got our own internal employees as well. And all of these individuals have to gain access, typically through a VPN, to the systems that we want. Now, as organizations are ever more dynamic and the speed of business is increased, the amount of churn of these people has also increased as well. So our employee base will change, roughly 10% of our employee base will change every year. Our IT service providers will change every 1 to 3 to 5 years. And the users supporting those contracts will change even more frequently. Vendors and service companies and consultants will be on short-term projects or medium-term projects and then be cycled out. So we have this revolving door of people that need to gain access, and that in itself is quite a long and large amount of work to be able to constantly get these users, put them into some form of directory or some form of place where we trust who they are, and then give them access. In some extreme examples, this can take up to 8 weeks. And particularly with service providers, you know, the clock is ticking. The money is being paid for the service, but if it takes 8 weeks for you to give them access, you're spending money on a service not actually being delivered, and it's ultimately the organization's fault for giving access. So you can see there's a few issues here, but that provisioning and deprovisioning is the biggest one from a lot of organizations' point of view. It's very time consuming, it's very painful, and it's fraught with confusion and mistakes. So what we try to do here is look at the kind of problem that we're looking at. Well, users and vendors will need access to a lot of systems, and not necessarily for prolonged periods of time. It's not going to be standing access. Remote access can be insecure depending on how it's built and who the users accessing it are. It's dynamic, ever-changing, and the registration and onboarding can be incredibly painful and slow for organizations. So what do we want to try and do? Well, we want to try and make this as quick and easy as possible, particularly for those short-lived contractors. This becomes incredibly important, where we can publish or send an email or a text to an individual that allows them to self-register using their own phone, using biometrics, so we can ensure that it's the right user, it is guaranteed to be the user that you've given access to, getting access to a system for a defined period of time, and then that access is reduced. So this can be used across third parties, contractors, and internal users to allow us to be able to very quickly give users access to systems for a defined period of time, whether that be for a month, for a year, for a singular transaction for a particular 15-minute change window. So this is a very quick, easy way of being able to onboard users and then also offboard them afterwards as well. And this obviously has some benefits around being able to do things quicker, but also reduce the cost of waiting to give users access. So how do we start? Where do we go? How do we do this? There are 3 big questions that need to be answered when running one of these programs of work. And the first one is, who are our users? It sounds like a simple question. We know who our employees are, but do we know all of our users? Do we know all of our contractors? Do we know all of our third parties, our service providers? And who are the users underneath that? That in itself isn't necessarily a hard piece of work. The question underneath that becomes very difficult. Well, what should they have access to? And this is a big subjective question. Just because a user has standing access to a system today doesn't mean they need that access moving forward. Understanding who these users are, their risk to you as an organization and what they need to have access to allows you to start grouping users into buckets very simply. This is a low risk user, this is a medium risk user, this is a high risk user. And by bucketing these users, we can start to profile them and then start to define how we're going to give them access to systems, to assets. The second question is, what is the value of our assets and the risk of these assets as well? A clean CMDB is incredibly useful here. Very rare, but incredibly useful. And having that asset log to say, these are our assets, these ones are low, these are medium, and these are high risk or valuable, we can then start to easily say, a low risk user connecting to a low value asset is going to be treated very differently than a high risk user connecting to a high risk asset. And what we're going to ask of that user, or what process that user is going to go through to gain access, is going to vary. So we get more control, we get more certain that the access is legitimate and that it is controlled and it's the right access at the right time to the right asset. And finally, we can then start to look at the level of control you want to enforce. And it can be as simple as, please just log on using MFA and with a valid ticket number. Or we can start to say, well, can you give me a reason? Can we start to really understand what you're trying to do here? What's the output we're going to get? And by driving users through this process, it allows us to allow them to self-serve. We can link off of existing processes to try and automate this. And ultimately, we can start to ensure that as our user base changes and our asset base changes, we can constantly keep up, because we know who our users are. We've defined what risk means to them. We know what our assets are. We've defined the risk associated with that, so that we don't have this process of running a project, being secure and having efficiency, and then degrading. It stays consistent over time. And there's some free tools here which we'll go into in a bit more detail that can help you do some of these, help you answer some of these questions. So we've defined who our users are, what our assets are, and what level of control I want to enforce. We need to build a plan and a success framework of what that actually means. Looking at why we're actually doing this in the first place, what our main motivation is, whether that be compliance or audit, best practice, control, visibility. And then building out our strategy and building out people and process element of the project. So understanding how our organization will change. We are going to be changing the way that a user gets access to a system. It will look the same or very similar, but ultimately their route to access is going to change. The processes that we may need to update, or the processes that we may need to amend to be able to ensure that our access is relevant for today as opposed to yesterday, and the level of capabilities and recording and visibility that we want to show to auditors or to manage our environment correctly. And then we map where we start from. Very simply, we look at our compensated controls and we decide where we want to go. There's a lot of avenues to go down, and it's really a case of carving the elephant up and choosing the right places to start and tracking it as we go through. Because as you know, with lots of projects, the starting destination isn't necessarily where you end up. We learn things, we see things, and the education allows us to shape that program over time to actually get into a place where we've reduced risk and also allowed more efficiencies. And very simply, we want to plan twice and do once. Looking at those areas that have the highest bang for buck, those that have high impact on risk or operational inefficiency, but those that have low effort or have a low impact if something was to change quite quickly. Very easily, we start to go through those that are high impact and low effort and move down the stack as we go. So we've talked a little bit about today, but what does the future look like? Well, applications and systems and infrastructure is changing dramatically. You know, we've gone from single servers with singular applications on, and we've slowly moved through that, virtualized all the containerizers, and now we're into microservices where things don't exist for long periods of time. They are very, very short-lived. They exist for a moment to run the function, and then they disappear. This creates quite a large change in the way that IT works, for the better. Things move a lot quicker here, but we need to manage this and control this. We've seen a lot in the news around people using or abusing cloud environments and microservices to be able to run all kinds of new modern malware and attacks. So being able to control this and manage this and be able to do this in real time at the speed that the business needs becomes key. And really the future of passwords, SSH and secrets is around doing this in a dynamic fashion, and as systems get created, control gets created, and as they get deprovisioned, reducing the control. DevOps is a key area. Organizations are moving further and further and further to be able to push code more quickly and being able to get systems out. Again, every single phase of a CI/CD pipeline has lots of new tools and has lots of different points of which there is a digital handshake, which require credentials. And today there is a technical debt that is being created where developers are using traditional password mechanisms or using individual kind of code bases where they will store passwords, which we see a lot in the news, where there is lots and lots of problems with this. First of all, it's difficult to go and find all these credentials and put them in the right place. Typically, the only place that this is ever remembered is in that developer's head. So if they leave, you kind of lose the order of where these credentials are being used and the dependencies associated with them. And also, it's time consuming. You need to go and find these credentials and put it into code. Whereas allowing a user to self-serve with a call command, you can just plug in to every single stage, means that you've got a single place to control access and a single place to be able to allow developers to go to securely code, as opposed to today, which typically can be a little bit like the Wild West. The rise of automation is another area. Today, human users still do a lot of the work on infrastructure, but more and more we're starting to see systems and robots start to take over. If we fast forward into 5 years, 6 years time, humans touching systems is just going to completely disappear. It's going to be computers, it's going to be systems. But a robot can work 24 hours a day and twice as efficiently as a human. What if it's doing the wrong thing? The level of damage that can be caused here is just as important. You also have the second side of those robots that mimic the human users triggering them. How can you ascertain who did it? It wasn't me, it was the robot. You're going to see that a lot moving forward. So being able to treat these robots and treat these automation processes as users and being able to control them as you would a user is going to become very important into the future. And privilege is going to expand. Today we've talked about that traditional system administrator type of privileged user, but moving forward, particularly with the the advent of low code and things moving to SaaS, means that working with and dealing with applications and systems is becoming a lot more user friendly. You don't need to be as technical as you used to be. Furthermore, systems and data is becoming incredibly valuable. I would not be considered as a traditional privileged user, but I have access to HR data and I have access to product roadmap. The product roadmap in particular is something that potentially can affect a share price. So does that make me a privileged user? Yes, potentially into the modern world it does. So being able to look at users and those less technical users and also treat them as privileged depending on the kind of information they have access to and the systems they have access to, and allowing them to be able to access those systems in a completely native way using kind of modern SSO and MFA is going to be incredibly key moving forward, that we have those less technically literate users being able to access systems with a level of control and visibility that we can apply to normal privileged users. And it's going to get bigger. I mean, it's pretty pervasive as it is today, but privilege is going to expand and go further and further and deeper into more and more systems and processes. And I'm sure this will change even in the next year as to what that's going to look like. So the assets, things that we can do to help you. So there is a number of free tools that we offer that you can log on to the website and download today. We have our discovery and audit tool called CyberArk DNA, Discovery and Audit. This will allow you to be able to scan your environment. This is mainly to your traditional legacy environments. And this will allow you to be able to profile where are the privileged accounts, what is the risk associated with them, when have they last been used. And this will allow you a very quick snapshot to see where are those privileged accounts, what's the risk associated with them, are they vulnerable to very common attack techniques, and have they been used? If they haven't been used in a very long period of time and they're enabled, maybe you want to disable them. And if they're disabled and not been used for a very long period of time, maybe we can start to look at deleting them and reducing the number of accounts and reducing the attack surface. We have a very similar tool called CyberArk Skyark, which is exactly the same kind of idea, but into cloud environments, allowing us to be able to scan a cloud environment and do a very similar thing. Where are the credentials? How are they being used? What's the risk associated with them? Are they vulnerable to common attack techniques? And can we reduce those attacks? We also have an open source tool called Conjure, which allows you as an organization a way to provide your developers a secure way of managing credentials, SSH keys, and secrets within a CI/CD pipeline within DevOps. Again, all of this is free. You can download it all here. And we also have a CyberArk blog. There's an awful lot of information here, and it kind of goes through cradle to grave. How do we start? What do we need to think about? How do we figure out how to present a privileged account management program of work, whether we're starting or finishing, to the business, and what does that look like, and how do we move forward? And of course, you can ask us in Turnkey to help as well. So, is there any questions?
Thanks very much for that, Dan. That was a great insight into the world of privileged access management, and understanding how technology can help improve security and risk postures. I mean, it just goes to prove that this sort of technology not only manages to keep your admins happy and more productive, but most importantly, it will keep the auditors satisfied. For me personally, it was great to understand how at the same time as implementing this new technology, you can actually save money by reducing costs. Just a quick note on that, actually, that if anyone needs help in framing a business case, we've worked with CyberArk to help clients understand what the return investment is, what the cost savings are, and what that would look like specifically tailored to them. So if that's something that would be useful for you, please do reach out to us. That's something we can absolutely help you with as well. So once again, Dan, thanks. I think we now have a few minutes left to answer some of your questions. Well, we do have quite a lot of questions, but we've only got a limited amount of time. So any we don't get to, we will take offline and get back to you in due course. So just looking here now, the first one. So Dan, where does privileged account management fit into a full spectrum identity and access management program?
Yeah, it's a question I get asked a lot. So identity, I think more and more is becoming a central tenet to a security program of work. Building a big wall around a data center that's not yours, with users that aren't yours, running applications that aren't yours, it isn't necessarily the right way of going about things anymore. The thing that is the most static in an environment today is the human user. But there's a few different areas with that. CyberArk is very much around looking at controlling those users' access to systems. But we don't know who they are. We don't know exactly the level of governance around them. So what you'll normally find is an umbrella of identity that will have a few different key areas, where you'll have identity governance as a part of it. And that's very key, right? We need to understand who those users are and what they should have access to. The second element of that is then privilege, to be able to control those users' access to systems. And then you'll normally have a third tenet, which is around single sign-on and MFA, to be able to actually put some level of control against all users. If you're looking at those three areas, you want to make sure that you're protecting the basket that holds all the eggs. So MFA has to be key as part of all of that.
Cool. Yeah, I think as well. I think over the last, over the last 10 years, we've kind of seen a shift as well in the marketplace for IAM. So traditionally, what we'd have found was that people were really interested in the kind of the provisioning angle of things, so getting people access to things a lot quicker. We also seen a lot of people started around the kind of the single sign-on elements of things, as you quite mentioned. But just in the last few years, we've seen a significant shift towards privileged access management, and I think that is just down to the level of cyber attacks, the amount of downtime, the amount of cost that's happening to firms across the globe, and it's now it's most days that you would you kind of look on the news and somebody else has had a breach and it's costing money and things like that. So yeah, absolutely, Dan. Thanks for that. Let's have a look at another question. So we have one here. Where does privilege fit into a proactive security framework?
Yeah, so I think we're starting to see a lot of organizations move away from that list of technologies they need to buy. And as opposed to looking at it just as a list, people are starting to be a bit more risk focused and looked at, well, actually, where are our holes, where are our issues, and actually getting to a point where they're starting to actively go after potential areas. Now, privilege is one of these areas which is commonly abused in many attacks. Really, for an attacker, to do something to be able to achieve their goal, at some point in that chain, a privileged credential needs to be used, whether that is to mask the activity and make it legitimate, whether it be to access a system, or whether it be to deploy some malware or to be able to extract information. At some point in that chain, privilege needs to be used. And being able to control that allows us to kind of move the goalposts in our favor and give us a higher chance of being able to defend, but also allows us to then start looking at what users are actually doing. And not necessarily in a way that we don't trust our user base, but there is always going to be that user that's trying to do something they're not supposed to. There's always going to be that back door that we forgot about that's been created. And how do we then go and find that? Because that's the thing that hurts you. You know, the bit that's under control is not the area that's the problem, is the bit that's not. And how do we go and find that? And using analytics and using the data that can be captured using privilege allows you to go and find those hotspots, the bits that are really going to really catch you out.
Absolutely. Yep. No, cheers, Dan. That's a great answer. So we have another one here. What about controlling standard user access to sensitive systems, and how does privilege fit in with that? Yeah,
so this is more towards the more modern version of what a privileged user is. So the difference between these two types of users is that a modern privileged user, those that are less technically literate, really don't want to go through any form of change in the way that they access systems. It's very difficult to go and ask your CFO, by the way, can you log on to this new system with all these new processes to be able to go and do the things you did yesterday? It's a very difficult conversation to have. So how do we go do that in a way that allows users a simple, easy access? And really, we have to start looking at the systems they're connecting to and being able to essentially be a broker between the user and the system in a completely native and silent way. SSO is part of that, that when a user is in an area that we trust and know, they should be able to gain access with some kind of a behavioral monitoring and understanding that it is actually the user doing it. But when a user wants to connect through to SAP, to Workday, through to any form of SaaS system or system they use, we need to be able to catch them as they log in. And that really becomes the magic. How do we get a user to come through a technology where they don't even know they're coming through it? So really is looking at putting proxies in place that are invisible, being able to ensure that users that we want to control are controlled, but they don't see that they are being controlled. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think another point to that as well is, especially around admin users, is that what you tend to find is that admin users usually have multiple accounts. So they'll have their standard day-to-day account, and then in order to log into to systems, their normal day-to-day account won't have the relevant privileges they need, and they'll have to log in using their like a kind of an administrative account, if you like. So using a product like CyberArk can actually get rid of all of those accounts, and what it means is that you can actually just kind of log into the CyberArk system with your own day-to-day account, which doesn't have any privileges. And then when you need to access those systems, it can actually elevate your privileges to that, which is from a best practice, from a governance, from a compliance perspective, that's absolutely the thing that the company should be aiming for. Cool. So how long does it take typically to implement CyberArk? When would I start to see the return of investment and benefits that you've mentioned?
So it does depend. Depends on how big we go, depends on the systems we're looking at, depends on the complexity, and also looks at the legacy IT. So where have we been before? What pieces are in place? Now, if we understand who our users are and what they should have access to, and we understand the value or the risk of our assets, it's actually a very quick piece of work. Installing CyberArk or running CyberArk from our SaaS platform is very, very quick. But we need to understand who the users are and what the assets are before we can start to connect the two together. So a typical project, when phased out, will normally take about 6 weeks for the first phase to be able to install, get some form of control for those high impact, high risk accounts straight out the gate. So it's quite quick to do that. But that long tail can be as long as an organization really wants to go. As you normally would look at a project, you'd start off in an area that's causing you issues, something that's high risk, and slowly but surely you can add to it iteratively over time. You don't need to do the whole thing all in one go. As your posture changes, you might want to go further. Likewise, if you're happy where you are, 6 weeks might be enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just to, again, as with everything IT, it depends, right? But typically what we see is you can start to realize benefits within that 6-week period, and you can tackle key areas and high risk areas of your estate, and that can then grow out. And the great thing is that up to from 6 weeks to 6 months, you can protect huge amounts of your estate from some of the most common risks and attack vectors as well. So very, very quickly, within a short period of time, you can actually start to maintain the control over your full estate. And then as Dan says there, you can quite rightly spend additional time on board in the more complex legacy applications as well. So I think one of the benefits, and kind of tying into what we were saying about earlier about people prioritizing kind of PAM over some of the other IAM pillars, is because there's a huge risk to an organization, and it's a very, very kind of quick win for an organization if you're going down the IAM route to implement PAM and reduce that risk, and therefore some of the consequences that not doing that could bring to the organization. So I think with we probably have time for probably one more. So what would be my first steps to understanding my environment so I know what challenges I need to address?
So I think there's a couple of things that'd be worthwhile looking at. So those 3 questions, conceptually, just thinking about them, with people in your organization is key. And trying to get an understanding of what the new world might look like. Who are our users? What are our assets? But then also using those free tools that we offer. You can go and download them, and it really is a very quick, easy process to be able to get a snapshot of what your environment looks like, the risk associated with that environment, where you can start to reduce the number of accounts. And by reducing the accounts, you reduce your risk posture and really start to plan where you want to go. There might be areas there that are just, red hot that we need to deal with today. And those that actually we can kind of leave until tomorrow. That would be the first starting point and give you visibility as to, first of all, is there risk? And then secondly, how do you prioritize it? Cool.
Thanks, Dan. And I think it's just worth mentioning as well, and reiterating what Dan said as part of the presentation. There are some tools that we can run. So there's the DNA tool, which scans the kind of on-premise environment, and then there's the cloud-based version of that tool as well. So I mean, we've run that successfully for many clients, and what that does is within a couple of days it can give you an indication of where those high risk accounts are in your organization, give you an indication of your risk posture around privileged access. So again, feel free to reach out to either myself or Dan, if you would like us again to help you with undertaking any of those things. So thanks again, Dan. So unfortunately, guys, we've come to the end of our allotted time, and we do have some further questions. Apologies that we didn't have the time to get to them. We will take those offline and respond individually to them. I would just like to thank you for joining us today, and also Dan for an excellent session. Just a reminder that the sessions are available online and on demand to rewatch at your leisure, and also you can still register for the final couple of sessions today, so please feel free to do so. Again, if you do have any questions or you'd like help with anything that you've seen or heard today in this session, please feel free to contact me directly with the details on the screen now. And just finally, just to say, we hope you enjoyed this session and the rest of the conference. Thanks again for joining us today. Stay safe and have a great rest of your day.